we at the PA have no intention to opt out. If the NBA decides that they want to opt out, they are welcome to opt out. June 30th would be the end of the season. We have an agreement for another year, quite frankly. And our players are fine continuing to play the game that they love for another year under the circumstances that we have. So while it is important and critical, because I like to meet deadlines and I'm just as competitive as our players are, I also recognize that it's not about giving up, you know, something that's critically important to meet a deadline that's really quite fictitious, to be honest.
That's real. So Tamika, just walk us through how you got on Point Forward here today.
First of all, thank you very much. This is such a privilege, so thank you for doing this. You know, it's a really great question, Andre, because the reality is, I don't know if you, and I know you're a big book reader. In The Alchemist, I remember they said when you make a decision, the universe sort of conspires to make things happen. And I do feel like that's essentially what happened. So I, you know, started, as you know, in fact, I think I worked with you almost 11 years ago when we were involved in the investigation and I was at Deloitte. And then that was sort of my first exposure to the NBPA. I had worked with the NFLPA some time before. So fast forward, you know, 12 years and I find myself in this position. But predominantly, I think I was aware of this role, but I was in a position at Deloitte that, quite frankly, I was a year out of potential retirement. And when they started the search, and I kind of thought, well, at this point, you know, it's been 26 years, you got to sort of see it through to the finish, right? And then COVID hit. And then the opportunity presented itself once again. And as I was sitting at home watching George Floyd and all the things that were happening there, I kind of thought, like, I need to serve my purpose. Like, now is the time to sort of take what I've learned and do something different with it and serve a purpose, do something that I would be really proud of. You know, when you turn 50, you sort of start to think to yourself, you got less days left. And so you want to make sure that you're really making an impact. And so here I am.
That's
so
beautiful.
Incredibly grateful.
That's beautiful to hear. And this is hearing you speak on George Floyd and around COVID. I was just reading about Hobson and starting Aerial Investments, and they have a new fund and leading that charge. And it was centered around George Floyd. And, you know, we had a lot of Fortune 500 companies talking about giving back to our community and making those promises. And, you know, just hearing you speak on that and speaking on being an entrepreneur, Fortune 500 companies running Deloitte. How many people did you lead at Deloitte?
We had 17,000
17,000 that you were in charge of.
Yeah, the largest in the world for Deloitte, actually.
The world, Craig. So I want to go back to your childhood and, you know, talk to us about the things that happened in your childhood, centering around being an entrepreneur, checking the cash register, you know, making sure the bar is good, you know, making sure the family of entrepreneurs are well, and, you know, your background with your mother going to college while having you and your aunts, uncles, and grandma, you know, how you just took hold of the family business.
Yeah, so thank you. I guess, as you know, I did grow up in a really small town, very, you know, a tobacco farm, sort of right outside the house, right on the Chesapeake Bay. And there wasn't a lot that you were exposed to be quite honest. So my family owned a ton of businesses. We had a tire shop, we had a bar, we had a speech therapist practice. And for me, it was about, I learned immediately that it was really about serving others. You know, my dad would drive down the road, he was waving, and everyone would always say, like, oh, he speaks to everyone. And I learned that it was really about sort of what can you do for someone else? And it wasn't really about you. And so anything that I'm doing from my experiences is about how can I use this to serve other people? And, you know, some of that is about being present, right? And being present here. I would watch my dad, like there could be millions of things going on, and he was present. He was in the moment with you. He thought about how he was going to communicate, what he could give to someone. And it taught me really at a young age that that's what was truly important. Little did I know that you'd see that playing out in real life every single day about
Mhm.
serving other people and being present in the moment and looking at what you can do for them as opposed to what you can take. The world is so full of, taking things, right?
Mhm.
I recognize that money, quite frankly, was a metaphor for paying for something, but the
Mhm.
reality is you had so much more to give than taking people's money. And so I think that taught me that at a really early age.
And is that where your phrase "reimagine the possible" derived from? That
Yeah,
type of
I'd love to
situation?
say it did, but you're exactly right. Those situations, like, imagining all of the things that we can do, we sort of get in this mode of we've got to do things a certain way because it's been done that way before, instead of thinking about sort of what the possible is and reimagining what that is.
So when you were working, originally with the first NBPA to go over the Hunter era, during that time, I know you said that you love working with numbers and everything because you can help find solutions. Was there anything that you foreshadowed to be like, hey, they messed up here, or this wasn't good here? One day, could I jump in and be able to, find great solutions for these individuals?
Yeah, and so I'd love to say, Evan, quite honestly, I don't think I was quite reimagining the possible then.
Yeah,
To be honest,
it was
it was a lot going on.
I need to work here and this.
But I will say that for certain, I recognize that there was so much more that could be done.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And quite honestly, I think that's how I ended up continuing to work with the NBPA and then to work with the WNBPA, because I really did see where I could make an impact, where I could use the things that I was doing and apply it. So we did, pro bono work for the W for a long time too, just to make sure we were giving back and that I was utilizing my expertise to do that.
So, I want to jump straight into, this is a unique pod for us because, it's centered around sports, culture, a lot of tech and business. And here we are in the midst of the CBA agreement, which is probably, not probably, it is the foundation and it is probably the most scrutinized piece of work on both sides. And it will be, there's going to be a microscope over it over the next 2 or 3 years. And there's always, what do you call it, foreshadowing in terms of who won, who got over on who, all those things. And so I want to really dive into that. What was that feeling like reading the CBA for the first time when you were introduced to this role or having the opportunity to take over this role?
First of all, I will tell you the initial CBA was, a few pages. Like we even looked at it the other day. It's, micro in comparison to where it is now. So over 500 pages. And the reality is it brought in the point that we talked about earlier. It was like reimagine the possible. When I read through it, there were things that I was going over that I thought, gosh, that's pretty antiquated. And we shouldn't be doing things that way. And I thought about, the players' freedoms and, things that they should be considering and why is this in here and things like that. And I remember the first day I actually had a conversation with the general counsel. He's like, oh, well, we got all these other things that we've got to take care of first. And I'm like, no, we got to just reimagine if we sort of redid all of these things. So, it was always this moment of like what could be as opposed to what was. And it's harder to move people from what was, particularly when they become comfortable. Right. And so trying to get them to someplace else is really what I think has been the most challenging.
Yeah. CJ McCollum, the union president, he said that you put all the players in positions to think like a CEO in the next movement and really, open up the game. And he said anytime you can open it up and, try to bring in more revenue, that's at the forefront of conversation. So I think that's been the number one thing he's, appreciated, at least from the union president side of it. But I wanted to comprehend on, also besides the fact of, having that mindset to the forefront, but changing the narrative of the players as well. I remember the last lockout when it occurred in 2011, 2012, our social media and people on the street were kind of blaming us for the lockout. And I was like, it's kind of unique where you're in a world where, no disrespect to anybody, but the millionaires are being blamed and the billionaires are the defendants. And I think obviously since that time, we moved forward as a unit and as a league. But, what part do you want to attack in essence to really change the narrative and keep the media out of it and keep it classy.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And I think when you talk about how do we change the narrative,
Yes.
there has been a lot of discussion around being a partner. You know, I hear from Adam, we are in a partnership. I hear from other people, we're in a partnership. Well, a partnership, a true partnership means that you are sort of on the same playing fields, right? No pun intended. And to some extent, I feel like even though a lot of people say a lot of things, it's really so important that we actually put our actions behind that. So that then means that you are thinking about how are we leveling the playing field? How are we rewarding our greatest asset? How are we making it such that they can move and have freedom of movement? You know, all of those things that are critically important. But it's not just about changing what we say. It's about in what we do in our actions and how that's being represented and, quite frankly, how it really plays out. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, honestly, in this CBA is that, you know, it's not all of the issues around economics, right? Everybody can get behind the numbers. The reality is this is about, you know, player freedom, you know, getting their respect, having equitable relationships. If our governors can do it, why can't our players do it? You know, that type of thing. If our governors can advertise for sports betting, why can't our players advertise for sports betting? If our governors can invest, why can't we invest? That's all. And that, surprisingly to me, is a much tougher road than telling someone that you want to be paid more, et cetera. There's none of that going on. It really is about sort of equity. And that's what our players want. They recognize that they should also be seen equally as we're growing the pie together in this partnership.
Yeah, like what Dre said, he mentioned on a pod a few times. It's like there's been opportunities to invest in that he can't partake in due to the simple fact that the governors of the teams are investing in it. And it's like, some of these big money plays or some of these moves that are done, like what else are you supposed to do with the money? It's kind of like just shutting you out of all avenues and areas in order to continue to make money for your family and, you know, not so much have to be a worker.
That's right. And that's part of, that's part of reimagining the possible, right?
Yes.
Like, I think that obviously when we started playing the game, the players weren't making the type of money where they could invest alongside our governors. Well, now they are. And quite frankly, they have the wherewithal, they have the resources to recognize that, you know, what am I going to do when the ball stops bouncing? Where should I be putting my money? What should I be thinking about? How do I create generational wealth? And that does mean taking on investments, et cetera. And in the instances where a governor is invested in Amazon, you shouldn't invest in Amazon. Are you serious? Like, how could you have any impact or independence rules or regulatory requirements? It's not real. We are all, you know, ready and willing to support things that are real. If there's a real conflict, if there's a real opportunity circumvention, we obviously want to avoid it. But that's not what we're talking about here. And so it's about reimagining what we can do better together. And I will tell you, many of the governors are on board too. They want to see this happen too. Many of our players have great relationships with their governors that they're talking about investments and what they could and should be doing. So it's just a matter of making sure we're opening up the gates so that those things can actually happen.
And I want to speak to the difficult position that you're put in as, you know, an African-American female ahead of 450 first-generation wealth young men with no real financial education before they get here. So 19, 20 years old, just being thrown a boatload of money. And you're told to protect them. And it came to my mind just recently. Adam Silver is known as a player's commissioner, which is very beneficial to his profile as a commissioner on both sides. You know, you can leverage that. But for you, talk to me how it's been pros and cons from your vantage point, because I don't think you have the similar, you know, perception because you're not allowed to be friendly with the other side. So kind of talk to us about how you've been able to navigate through that.
So it is interesting. I guess, you know, first, you are right that that's what Adam is known for. He's incredibly proud of it. I think our players are proud of the relationship that they have with them. And so I, to some extent, I think that that's good, right? Because you certainly want to make sure that even in most business relationships, it's personal, right? And so the fact that he can have those relationships with individuals is great. What is challenging is it's very different than any other, you know, sport in the US, right? And so it does put a little bit more light between me and the players, because most of the people that have either been in the union or have been at the NBA have been there for a long time, right? So they know everything. They know about relationships. They're able to make things work, to shift things very differently. And that's really helpful for our players. And so we never want to sort of let that go. And I will tell you, Adam has been incredibly kind to me and supportive. But I also recognize that I really have a job to do. And when, to your point, you have players that are coming in, many of whom may be first generation in terms of wealth. And it is important to me that I'm exposing them, because I think what we get lost on, because all of us sort of grew up in a place where you got an A, that meant you were doing fine. If you made X dollars, that meant you were doing things. We're always measured, right? Everything is being measured. The reality is, though, it's about exposure. You have no idea what you don't know until you've been exposed to it, right? And so the best thing that I can do, I don't need to sit them down in front of, financial statements and walk through a balance sheet, although we are going to do that this summer. But I also recognize it's about exposing them to the right people who can tell them the stories that they can relate to, that they can get as mentors and help to guide them. And that's really how I'm trying to do it, so that it's a little bit more organic as opposed to sort of pushed upon people, because that never works either, right? It's about sort of being able to relate to individuals and learning what you should and could be doing and exposing them to something different.
And how do you find that balance? Because you go back in history and you speak on the perception of the relationship between the union head and the league head, and you go to Billy Hunter and David Stern, and they would, there were rumors of, Billy would always fall into David's lap and kind of fall into like, yes. And we never fought back hard enough. And then, when we got the first African-American female executive director for our union, Michelle, who's a, tough lawyer from DC, you heard the opposite narrative where she's too tough, so. And I spoke about Adam being, he's able to maneuver on both sides. How do you find a balance of I'm tough, but I'm still building a partnership with the league?
Yeah. So, I do believe strongly in being kind and respectful to one another, right? I also appreciate the value of relationships. For the last 26 years being in consulting, that's what it was about. People tended to do business with people that they liked. All things being equal, that's what they did. And so having that relationship with the league and understanding their perspective is critically important. However, I can never take my eyes off of what I'm here to do. And that is to protect, support, and amplify our players. So at all cost. So if it means that I have to be very clear that something is not going to be acceptable, like we are in the situation we're in now, I am crystal clear. It doesn't mean that I have to destroy someone, while this is happening. This is a unique situation, quite frankly, because having been an expert for the last 20 years and going and testifying in trial and you walk away, et cetera, you never see those people again, right? In this particular instance, you still have to maintain a relationship, because our goal ultimately is to continue to grow the pie for all of us, right? So for the league, the governors, for our players, first and foremost. And so if you destroy that relationship while you're trying to negotiate the CBA, the end game is that we've got to move this on. That won't be success for us. So I've got to keep my eyes on the prize and recognize what I'm really here to do and to make sure that that happens. It does not mean that we have to be unprofessional or not be respectful of each other, but it does mean that I have to get the job done.
Did you ever feel any pressure following up while you're behind Michelle Roberts?
No, I didn't. And in fact, I will tell you, I think the best thing that you could ever do is to be the first female, right? And then to have someone come behind. That is the best compliment you could ever have, right? And Michelle was always a friend to me. I was actually, I worked for her. She was my client when I was at Deloitte. I was her testifying expert, so I was familiar with her. I thought she did an amazing job. So I really, it was intimidating, of course, let's be clear.
Yeah, for sure.
But I felt like I could do it. I felt like I was ready.
So specifically pertaining to the CBA, we're coming up on the deadline to get done the extension, correct? And it's been a lot of conversations, a lot of different topics surrounding that. So just wanted to, kind of get your thoughts on where we are, where we will be and what the players' voices have been on various topics.
To be quite honest, it is a negotiation until the end. There's no question. And as I shared previously, I'm not giving up anything that I feel incredibly strongly about and that, our players are really invested in. So for me, we have worked really, really hard over this last year to get to what we consider the right solution where everybody, all of our boats are rising, right? That's really the objective. And so getting there means that there are some trades at the end and things that you have to consider. And there are some things that, are a hard no, right? A hard cap is a hard no. And so making sure that those things happen, if it means that on March 31st, we don't have an agreement, we don't have an agreement. But the reality is for our fans, things will continue as usual. Business will be as usual. What's important to note is that March 31st is a deadline for opt-out. We at the PA have no intention to opt out. If the NBA decides that they want to opt out, they are welcome to opt out. June 30th would be the end of the season. We have an agreement for another year, quite frankly. And our players are fine continuing to play the game that they love for another year under the circumstances that we have. So while it is important and critical, because I like to meet deadlines and I'm just as competitive as our players are, I also recognize that it's not about giving up something that's critically important to meet a deadline that's really quite fictitious, to be honest.
That's real. Well, how about in regards to, the media rights? I know that is going to end pretty soon. And do you see, media platforms like Apple or Amazon or, I think CJ said that eventually, reimagine a possible, we could be playing games in the metaverse. Like, where are you trying to take and set it up? Because I know for sure, technology and the future of that, it definitely plays a big part in the NBA as well.
Yeah, so in 2025, obviously, we will be looking at what the next media deal will look like. The good thing for us is people are always going to love live sports, right? And so I don't think we have any concern over content and media. What it will look like, I think, really remains to be seen. I do think it'll be a combination from some streaming platforms and television. I think it'll be a combination. People, everybody says now you have your personal device, half the world, if I walk up down the street on MSG, I see people in their cars watching the game, right? So they're looking at apps on their phone. I think it will all look very different. And because I'm a person that reimagines the possible, that is part of what makes this negotiation so challenging, right? Because I don't know where we're going. I don't think anybody really knows. We all can hypothesize as to where it's going to be, but I'm committing to something for a long period of time that'll take us through the media time. So I've got to make sure that I am putting us in a position that we have options if things end up in a very different place. So that's also complicated the CBA as well.
And I have a very technical question regarding that. What are your thoughts on the local media situation that's happened with Bally Sports? And that is kind of changing the scope of, how the league looks at those games surrounding the nationally televised contracts with the ESPNs and the Turners.
Yeah. So, you're right. And we have Sinclair and all of those things. So 16 of our local RSNs are now, we got to figure out how to run those on a national platform. And so it really is a game changer, quite honestly. And it is something that we're trying to figure out, how can you make that happen? The good thing for us, if I may be honest, is that we're about to head into playoffs, right? And most of the playoffs are nationally televised. So the RSNs, we don't have to be as concerned about. So the timing is good for us. And I think that we have enough cushion to get us prepared for next season. That's the thing that, gives me some safety, is that I think just given the timing of where we are, we'll find ourselves to be in a better position.
And speaking of going into playoffs and, teams leveraging position and players being healthy for the playoffs, the big topic is load management. And so this is like a round table discussion. A lot of the talk around load management is players don't want to play. And I'm trying to figure out how we can change that narrative, or how the narrative even got to the players don't want to play. And as we've talked about so many times, it's rarely up to the player to say, I'm not playing tonight.
That's right.
9 times out of 10, it's the team scheduling out. I mean, CJ McCollum's done a great job of speaking on it. I think he was talking to JJ Redick on ESPN in terms of before the season starts, the trainers are telling him exactly which dates he'll load manage, that he won't play.
That's right.
And it's hurting us, I would say, from, just our fans and their voices. And it's, I always think of the word lobbyist. You know what I mean? And it's the group that, kind of leverages the public attention to be on your side. So, kind of talk about, how you've thought about, not writing, but just getting that voice for those to hear, what the real is behind load management.
Yeah. So, you're right, Andre. There's two things. First of all, there is load management and then there's injury management. And there has to be that distinction first and foremost, right? You're coming back from an injury and you know how much time you need to be on the floor versus off, so that we can make sure our players can play for the long run, right? That's the objective there. When it comes to load management, it is disturbing, quite honestly, that the perception is that our players don't want to play. Our players want to play. They love to play. They take pride in the fact that they have 82 games in a season, or that, they have back-to-backs. I mean, this is something they're incredibly proud of, and they're geared up and ready for it. And even, when I did the tech summit at All-Star, Mark Cuban said, it is not our players. You've got our governor saying it's not our players. I don't know how that narrative got out there. What I do know is because our sport, oftentimes you're looking at an individual player and people come to a game to see an individual player. So what happens is we have all of these constituents that we have to be responsible for and to think about.
And with that, I'm seeing the average years of service are going down because I'm seeing a lot of young guys. Teams are giving up on them a little earlier. And Draymond has spoke on this. I thought Draymond had a great point when he said, it's not on the player all the time if he's considered a bust or not. Did the team develop him or did the team put him in a position? And we've had a lot of conversation with other players talking about some of our younger teams are having the issues, whether it's off the court or immaturity, or you can see, spats with a coach on the bench where there is no veteran presence. But to that, there's a caveat there. Why is it that? Because player security is a pillar of a union. You want a player to be able to work for as long as possible in that job.
Yes.
But the younger you get, you take away those older jobs. And I feel like the veteran players are becoming like the NFL running back, where it's not as valued, but it's a very valuable position.
It's an incredibly valuable position.
No doubt. Well, we have a segment called Guns and Butter. We say it every time on the pod, but people think of it as a macroeconomic, principle, but actually it's from the movie Baby Boy. Have you ever seen that movie with Ving Rhames? And he's talking about guns and butter. And he discusses like the micro decisions that you make that may not seem huge in a moment, but they pay dividends hugely, in retrospect. What have you done where you think, you made a small decision and this catapulted you up to be, the strong woman you are?
Yeah, so there are probably so many things. I wouldn't say there's one singular moment. So one I think of quickly as kindness. The other I think of as I am always talking about this pie. And I alluded to it earlier because I think it's important even for our players around performance is the P, I is for image, and E is for exposure. And Carla Harris writes about this. And she says that, typically as minorities, as females, we focus on performance and we spend 90% of the pie really focused on performance and very little on image and exposure. And the reality is that the people that we see that are the most successful, it's because they are spending time in that. And when she refers to image, she's not talking about, what you look like. It's about how you show up, sort of the confidence you exude when you walk into the room, exposing yourselves to things that make you feel uncomfortable. And, growing up in a really small town and going to a public school most of my life up to the 8th grade with my brother who was also in public schools. But for me, I thought, gosh, I got to the point where you could decide to go to another high school. And I thought, wow, maybe I should consider doing something different. Like we certainly didn't have the means to do that.
Mhm.
God bless my parents, because I was like, you know what? I want to go to St. Mary's Riken because I wanted to do something that was different. And I didn't know that meant that I was going to be exposed to something else. Unfortunately, I also didn't appreciate that I'd be, one of two in a class of 200 that was African American.
Mhm.
But that was about getting the exposure to things that I may not have been able to. And so learning more about the law, learning more about traveling internationally. I hadn't even been on a plane at that point, right? And so learning those things and getting exposed to those things, I see your eyes getting bigger. No plane? And not getting exposed to that earlier, it was a game changer.
Mhm.
Even sitting at, people's homes and they're having dinner parties and you're seeing how those things are done. And,
Yep.
it's sort of like being a little fly on the wall.
Mhm.
That's what it did for me, because then I could imagine something different.
Right.
And when you're, kind of secluded and you're being protected and you don't have the means, this was a way to sort of be that child in the room. So as I think about how that impacted me, I think it really was huge for me.
Mhm.
Really was.
And I'm going to go back earlier right now with this question. So give me your educational background and your credentials to let everybody know who you are and what you've accomplished to be prepared and well equipped to succeed in this position.
Yeah, because I read that, you guys interviewed 40 people, correct? Right, for this position?
Oh, we interviewed 40, but the candidate list was like, I don't know, a couple hundred.
Yeah, so even then to really, and it was filled with former politicians,
Yep.
former
Players,
yep,
CEOs.
CEOs. So
Mhm.
like to really say,
Mhm.
to take that cake.
See, I got the imposter syndrome coming on now.
No, well, Dre doesn't like anybody. So to say yes to something, I truly want to hear even deeper how you got into that, because Dre likes nothing at all whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I will, first of all, it is a blessing. There's no question. But just like you guys, I was raised with a mother and a father who were very clear that you had to exceed expectations, right? That, just showing up was not enough.
Mhm.
Just, passing was not enough. You had to do more. And, that whole twice as good or, more than most people. And I actually didn't really know what that meant. I just knew that I had to keep driving. And, Andre, you mentioned before, my mother was pregnant with me in high school and I was born in July and she went off to college in September. Because she knew education was an equalizer and she had to keep going. And so I had family members, et cetera, that were helping me. And so to some extent, I think I feel a little bit of guilt, like I've got to prove myself, I've got to do something. But I think she was just teaching me you had to be amazing. You had to reimagine sort of what, being pregnant as a single mother at 18 would look like. And so it taught me that I had to do that too, right? And so I think just looking at the whole concept, I don't know if you ever read this book, and I know you both are so well read, but George Fraser wrote this book called Success Runs in Our Race. And he gave this example of an iPhone. And you probably don't know this, but prior to 2007, there wasn't an iPhone. Can you imagine?
I was in the league before that.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm that old.
You was BlackBerry shorty.
So,
Sidekick.
I was a BlackBerry, yeah. Or the little flip StarTAC.
The Razors were the best phones.
The Razors were good.
That was a good time.
Who are responsive? No, just kidding. But I literally remember like having this great StarTAC and people would stand in line for hours for the iPhone, right?
Mhm.
Because it was amazing.
Mhm.
And whereas your other phone, you're willing to donate or even throw away, right? So it was a quick reminder. And he tells the story, like people were willing to throw away something that was good for amazing. And so I've always thought about like, what do you have to do to be amazing? So my goal was I was going to be a lawyer because growing up in Southern Maryland, like the only people you saw that were successful were doctors or lawyers. And so clearly I had to be one of those and I didn't like blood. So that wasn't happening. And so I decided I was going to go to law school immediately right out of undergrad. And the reality is I love business. And usually you went to law school to avoid the numbers. And I was going to law school and I love the numbers. So this is now 25 years ago, 27 years ago. And no one did JD MBA. Now it's much more popular. But at that time it was unheard of. And I remember going to the dean and saying, 1 in 4 people in Washington are lawyers. 1 in 4 professionals in Washington are lawyers. Like, what's going to make me amazing? And I thought, if I got my MBA and I had a law degree. And so that was part of what made me decide to do that. But it was also because I really had a passion for the numbers. I loved solving problems and doing those things. So I got out of law school and MBA program, and people were like, this is great. What are we going to do with her now? Because nobody knows what you do with it. So it was investment banking or tax. Tax. Yeah. So I decided I was going into tax because I didn't want to move to New York City at 20. Now, can you imagine that? Look, this is where God is laughing. Like, look at you now, right? And I love it here. That's right. That's right. So in my mind, I didn't know exactly what to do. But quite frankly, going to work for the Big Five at that time was the best training ground. I mean, we worked all night. We pulled all-nighters. We did all of the things that we needed to do to make sure that our clients were successful, right? And all things being considered, I could have probably stayed at KPMG for the rest of my life. But Enron happened. It was time to sort of figure out something new, something different. I could have stayed at KPMG, but it wasn't going to be playing to my passions of forensic accounting work. And so I decided it's probably one of the second time I took a risk in my life. I appreciated that taking risk really mattered. My mother would say the fruit is on the limb. I now tell my boys that fear can't stand for forget everything and run, but rather face everything and rise. And they have to choose to rise. And I feel like that's what I did. I could have stayed at KPMG, but I actually had people who wanted to go with me. They were like, where are you going? Arthur Andersen had fallen, and they had started, Andersen had actually started a new company called Huron in Washington, but they didn't actually have anyone working there yet. And so here we go back to this entrepreneurial spirit. I'm like, I can do this. Meanwhile, I just had my first son. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was convinced I could figure this out. We started with 12 people. We grew to about 180. We went public 2 years after I was there. Obviously didn't negotiate well enough because I'm still working, but it was a great experience to go through all of that. And it gave me an opportunity really to build my brand. And so here, fast forward, we then decide we're going to sell off Huron, and we sell off our advisory practice to Grant Thornton. But I was doing so much global work. I was working in Brazil and in China and in Europe, and they didn't have the platform to be able to service our clients abroad, whereas Deloitte did. But it was kind of scary because I went from being our co-CEO of our advisory practice to now being a line partner, right? And to some extent, obviously, I appreciate now how significant that was. But then I thought, I'm going to take a step back. And you talk about the imposter syndrome and like feeling like, oh my God, are they going to think I'm worth it or that I should be here? It was really, really hard. But it was the most amazing experience that I've ever had. And they allowed me to continue to grow and to continue to do things. And I learned about the imposter syndrome, and I learned to quiet that voice a little bit. And so it only rears its head like days like today or the first day I walked into this office. But I've learned that you can actually use it to be better. That's why I over prepare and I overwork, because it's what drives me is to make sure people know I belong here, I'm supposed to be here, or that I'm going to do what I'm set up to do. And so that's probably really what drives me. So fast forward, in 2017 in Washington, D.C., very, very challenging time. Obviously, we had a change in our administration in Washington, D.C., and people were not very kind. There was a lot going on. And they were like, Tamika, we're going to make you managing partner. And I thought, oh, my God. First of all, I was convinced that they had only interviewed me because they needed someone Black to interview, right? And you check that off in your mind, like they can't be serious. And then I remember Sam Silver, who is still a great partner and friend to this day, was like, no, it is you. This is your time. You deserve this. And it was a ride from there. It was just such an amazing experience. But I learned so much that I could then apply to this. So I'm really grateful. So thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Man, that's amazing.
Big bars. I'm listening like, God damn. I want to touch on the W. We talk about the W a lot. And it's, I just kind of want to be candid about it. It's a sensitive subject because obviously the game is growing. We're getting better numbers, better viewership. We got great TV deals. We're constantly interacting and working with the ladies from the W. And I just want you to touch on, what the league has done or what the union has done for the W, what we will continue to do, and what you've done for them, you worked on their collective bargaining agreement as well. And so I just want you to touch on the W and where do you see their future?
Yeah. So first of all, I do believe that it's up and coming, right? I think that there is so much potential in terms of what they will do and what we'll continue to see them doing. So to your point on the 2020 CBA, the biggest thing there is that we were able to add in shared revenue, just like, you all have. And I think that we are on the cusp of seeing where our women will have the opportunity to share in the revenue. I think that'll be a game changer. I think that's going to make a huge difference. We won't have as many people wanting to go to play, internationally before they want to play here in the U.S. So I think it's going to change the game. I think people are going to see it very differently. You're going to have more people investing W teams. I think you see it as an opportunity for expansion. So it is definitely on the rise. In terms of the union, I could not be prouder of our men and their support of the women. To your point, I mean, obviously we have individual players that are engaged, but even as a PA, we support them financially. We have shared offices with them. We go to market together when we can. I think that it is, while I know it's a story that isn't told very often, it is essential that it is, because they are all in. Our players are all in with our women to make sure that they're successful as well.
And so speaking on, taking on all that you have to take on with this particular job and, not only an African-American woman, but a mother. And I'm just asking as a mother, not to say that it's tough, but it is tough. Being a mother is just a different type of role that none of us can even try to imagine. Like, we can't reimagine the possible on that. that's the exception to the rule. But, what are some of the things that you've had to struggle through, being who you are in the position that you brought yourself to?
No, well, thank you very much for asking. I think, first of all, my youngest son was coming up on his senior year, and this job is in New York, and I knew that I was going to have to move to New York. And at first I was like, oh, it's no big deal, because I always worked all week, and it was it didn't matter if you were really home during the week, right? Because they barely saw you anyway. So I thought I could do that. It's just like being at work during the week and you're home on Fridays. But then it hits you that, like, it's their last year, right? And gratefully, I am so grateful that I have a husband who is a true partner in every sense of the word, who recognizes that, he has to put in more or do things. So he is reimagining the possible for sure, because he has really been like our rock, right? He has made sure that things are going smoothly. He was applying to colleges with Roke when, he went off to college and was playing football and dealing with those things. He's, Reese's manager for bass fishing. And to some extent, I get a little jealous sometimes, because I think I'm missing it, or they were talking about prom coming up, and, I've got all these ideas, right? Like I was like, Reese, you asked a girl and you just did a poster. I'm like, did you write it? I'm like, you should have told me. I would have bedazzled it up and, all of the things that you would want to do. But it's hard. And one day someone asked Reese, how do you feel with your mother being in New York? And he said, it's fine, because during the week we're all so busy anyway. But in the last couple of months, because of CBA, I have not been able to go home on the weekend. And that has, I feel the strain of that. And, making sure that that they know that they're still a priority to me. And that has been challenging. There's no question. But I think it does take sort of this village to make sure that these things are happening. And also recognizing, everybody knows, you get into day 12 and I'm like, oh my God, I've got to see my boys. If it's on, they have to drive up, they have driven up, because, you do miss them. And the one thing I remember specifically about the interview process, I'm not sure if you remember this, Andre, you were there, and CJ said to me, he had not had his first child yet. He goes, how in the world do you do this? How could you possibly do this? And it hadn't dawned on me, because I've always done it, right? I watched my mother and father do it. I've done it since the boys were babies. I told you we started a new company when I had a 1.5-year-old. So it's all I know. But when I'm reminded about the things that you miss and, those moments, right? It's hard. It's hard. And then you have, all of these things that are going on constantly. You got people criticizing you, and you got security issues, you have threats, and, all kinds of things that just make it, very challenging. But again, I try to keep my eyes on the prize and what I'm here to do, and to make sure that that gets accomplished. So that is what drives me, quite frankly, because I know my boys will grow up, and I want to make sure, one, I'm a good role model for them. I had my son, Roke, sent me a message last week, and he said, Mom, you got this. Like, he's coaching me. You got this. You go in there and you tell him, like, he's going through this thing. And I think that's a really positive thing for them to experience too.
Well, to the boys, I want to tell you, thank you for being patient and being understanding, because your mother is needed. And so, with ending, we appreciate your time and your energy and your passion. And we also appreciate, everything you've done that led you here to help you, not even help you, but put you in a position to help us. So we really appreciate you. And I know we have a lot of players listening. It's funny, I'm on the court sometimes, and a player will come up to me and say, I listen to the podcast. It's so weird to me. And so I'm just really, really happy and excited that a lot of our players who aren't as involved as they should, but, they get it. They will get a better understanding, and we continue to grow as a unit, as 450 players. You're our CEO, you're our boss, you're our motherly figure. And so just thank you so much. Very inspirational story. I have 2 daughters. So, I'll make sure they listen to this. The 5-year-old can probably listen to this.
Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.